The Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York houses extensive documentation of slavery's many cruelties and complexities. But some files reveal stories so unusual and so tragic that they demonstrate how individual acts of desperation within slavery's system could have devastating consequences for everyone involved. On a morning in April 2025, historian Dr. Angela Rodriguez opens a package that will lead her to uncover one of the most heartbreaking stories she has encountered. A case where in 1821, a wealthy white woman and an enslaved woman made a secret agreement to exchange their newborn babies in an attempt to save both children from their respective fates, an exchange that briefly succeeded, but that was eventually discovered, leading to the death of one child, the sale and disappearance of the other, the destruction of the white family's fortune and status, and the enslaved woman's own tragic end, a story that remained hidden for decades until testimony and documentation revealed what had happened and why two desperate mothers had attempted an impossible deception. The donation comes from a historical society in South Carolina that has been researching testimony from formerly enslaved people and unusual cases involving enslaved women and the families that enslaved them. The letter explains that while examining materials from the 1860s, 1870s, researchers discovered testimony and documentation about an incident from 1821 where two women, one a wealthy plantation owner's wife who claimed aristocratic European lineage and was called the Countess by locals, and one an enslaved woman, had secretly exchanged their newborn babies in an attempt to protect both children, an exchange that was eventually discovered with catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. Angela carefully removes the materials from their archival box. The first item is a photograph, styled like an 1870s domestic portrait, showing two women seated side by side, one white, one black, each holding an infant. The composition is deliberately symmetrical, but deeply unsettling. The white woman, wearing an elaborate dark satin dress with lace collar and brooch, holds a black baby swaddled in white cloth. Her expression is calm but distant, as though performing a role. Her hair is meticulously arranged. Beside her, the black woman wears a plain work dress with white apron and head covering, clearly marking her as domestic staff. She holds a white infant, cradled with the same careful posture. Her gaze meets the camera directly, steady, unblinking, emotionally unreadable. Her face shows practiced neutrality, suggesting she's accustomed to being observed without being consulted. The deliberate mirroring, the white woman holding a black baby, the black woman holding a white baby, creates a visual inversion that grows more unsettling the longer one looks. The wooden shelves and hanging linens behind them suggest a workroom or nursery, but the atmosphere feels formal rather than maternal. Angela turns the photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink, "Commemorative photograph, South Carolina, 1871." Depicting the exchange that occurred in 1821, the white woman represents Caroline Ashworth, called the Countess, who in 1821 secretly exchanged her newborn baby with her enslaved woman, Rachel's newborn baby. The exchange was discovered in 1823. Caroline's biological child, who had been raised as Rachel's child, died shortly after. Rachel's biological child, who had been raised as Caroline's child, was sold and disappeared. The Ashworth family fortune was destroyed. Rachel was sold away and died in 1825. This photograph was staged 50 years later to document what had occurred. And below that, in different handwriting, added much later, two desperate mothers tried to save their children through an impossible exchange. The Countess wanted to save her dark-skinned baby from being rejected by her husband. Rachel wanted to save her light-skinned baby from slavery. For 2 years, the deception held. Then it was discovered, and both children were destroyed. This is their story. Angela reads the inscription 3 times, her chest constricting. In 1821, 2 women, one wealthy and white, one enslaved, had secretly agreed to exchange their newborn babies. The white woman had given birth to a baby with dark skin, suggesting the child's father was not her white husband. The enslaved woman had given birth to a baby with very light skin, likely the result of rape by a white man. Both women saw their babies facing terrible fates. The white woman's dark-skinned baby would reveal her infidelity and face rejection or violence. The enslaved woman's light-skinned baby would face slavery despite appearance that might allow passing for white. So they exchanged the babies, each agreeing to raise the other's child. For 2 years, the deception worked. Then it was discovered. And both children, both mothers, and the white family's entire fortune were destroyed in the aftermath. Angela spends the rest of that day examining the other materials in the package. What she finds allows her to piece together the complete, tragic story through testimony given by people who knew what had happened, documentation of the aftermath, and accounts passed down through both white and black communities about the exchange of 1821. From testimony given in 1868 by an elderly formerly enslaved woman named Sarah, who had been present when the exchange occurred. "My name is Sarah. I am giving this testimony because I was present when the exchange happened in 1821, and I want the truth documented before I die. I am now approximately 70 years old. In 1821, I was approximately 23 and enslaved on the Ashworth plantation in South Carolina. Mrs. Caroline Ashworth was the plantation owner's wife. She came from a wealthy European family and claimed to have aristocratic lineage. People called her the Countess, though I don't know if that was her actual title. She was married to James Ashworth, who owned a large and prosperous plantation. Rachel was an enslaved woman on the Ashworth plantation, approximately the same age as Mrs. Ashworth. Rachel worked as a house servant and seamstress. In early 1821, both Mrs. Ashworth and Rachel were pregnant. Mrs. Ashworth was expecting her first child with her husband. Rachel was pregnant. We all knew the father was likely James Ashworth or his brother, as Rachel had been subjected to sexual abuse by both men. In March 1821, Rachel gave birth first. Her baby was a boy with very light skin, so light he could easily pass for white. When I saw that baby, I knew Rachel faced a terrible situation. Light-skinned babies born to enslaved women often faced particular cruelty. Sometimes they were sold away immediately, so they wouldn't be constant reminders of white men's sexual violence. Sometimes they were kept, but treated even more harshly. Sometimes they were used as house servants, where their appearance was considered less threatening. A few days later, Mrs. Ashworth gave birth. When I saw her baby, a girl, I was shocked. The baby had distinctly dark skin and features that clearly indicated African ancestry. It was immediately obvious that James Ashworth was not this baby's father. I don't know who the baby's father was. There were rumors. Some said Mrs. Ashworth had been involved with a mixed race or black man. Others said the baby's appearance was due to some distant ancestry in Mrs. Ashworth's family. But regardless of the reason, the baby's appearance was a catastrophe for Mrs. Ashworth. When James Ashworth saw the baby, He was furious. He accused his wife of infidelity. He threatened to divorce her, to expose her, to destroy her reputation. Mrs. Ashworth was desperate. She knew that if she kept this dark-skinned baby, her marriage would be destroyed, her reputation ruined. She would be disgraced and likely cast out of society. Several days after Mrs. Ashworth gave birth, Rachel came to her with a proposition. I was present because I was helping care for both babies. Rachel said to Mrs. Ashworth, "Your baby will be rejected because of her appearance. My baby will face slavery despite his appearance. What if we exchange them? I will raise your daughter as my own. She will be enslaved, but she will be protected and loved. You will raise my son as your own. He will be free and will have all the advantages of a white child. Both babies will be saved from the fates they would otherwise face." Mrs. Ashworth was shocked at first, but she was also desperate. She understood that this exchange might be the only way to save her baby and to save her own reputation and position. They made the agreement. That night, they exchanged the babies. Mrs. Ashworth took Rachel's light-skinned baby boy and presented him to her husband as their son, claiming the baby's coloring was simply very pale. Rachel took Mrs. Ashworth's dark-skinned baby girl and presented her as her own daughter. I helped with the exchange. I was sworn to secrecy. I understood that if the truth was discovered, all of us would face terrible consequences. For 2 years, the deception held. Mrs. Ashworth raised Rachel's biological son as her own child, naming him Thomas. The baby was accepted by James Ashworth as his son and heir. Thomas was light-skinned enough that no one questioned his parentage, especially as some babies are born very pale and darken later. Rachel raised Mrs. Ashworth's biological daughter as her own, naming her Mary. Mary had dark skin and was assumed to be simply another enslaved child born on the plantation. But in 1823, the truth was discovered. I don't know exactly how. There are different accounts. Some say a visiting relative noticed something about Thomas's features that made them suspicious. Others say someone who had been present at the births came forward. Others say James Ashworth himself began to notice features in Thomas that reminded him of Rachel rather than of his wife. However it happened, in late 1823, James Ashworth confronted his wife and demanded the truth. Under extreme pressure, Mrs. Ashworth confessed to the exchange. What followed was catastrophic for everyone involved. James Ashworth's first action was to retrieve his wife's biological daughter from Rachel. 2-year-old Mary, who had been raised by Rachel for her entire life, was taken from the only mother she had ever known. James Ashworth declared that even though Mary was clearly not his biological child, she was legally his wife's child, and therefore his property to dispose of. Within days, Mary became ill. Some say she died from the trauma of being separated from Rachel. Others say she was deliberately neglected or even harmed. Whatever the cause, Mary died before her 3rd birthday. James Ashworth then turned to the child he had believed was his son, Rachel's biological child, Thomas, who he had raised for 2 years as his heir. In his rage at the deception, Ashworth declared that Thomas was legally enslaved. As Rachel's biological child, Thomas inherited his mother's enslaved status. Ashworth immediately had Thomas sold to a slave trader, who took the child to the Deep South. Thomas was approximately 2 years old. We never learned what happened to him. Rachel was devastated. Her biological son had been sold away. The child she had agreed to exchange him for Mary, whom she had raised and loved for 2 years, had been taken from her and had died. The agreement she had made with Mrs. Ashworth, which she had believed would save both children, had instead resulted in both children being destroyed. Rachel was severely punished for her role in the deception. She was whipped repeatedly. Then she was sold to a plantation in another state. I heard that she died in 1825, approximately 2 years after the discovery of the exchange. Some say she died from illness. Others say she killed herself from grief. Mrs. Caroline Ashworth was also destroyed by the scandal. James Ashworth divorced her. Rare in that era, but possible given the magnitude of the deception and her confession of infidelity. Mrs. Ashworth lost her social position and her wealth. Her family in Europe disowned her. She lived the rest of her life in poverty and obscurity. I heard she died in the 1840s, having spent 20 years as an outcast from the society she had once belonged to. The Ashworth family itself never recovered. The scandal destroyed their reputation. Business relationships were severed. Within a generation, the family fortune was gone, and the plantation was sold. 2 women tried to save their babies through an impossible exchange. For 2 years, it worked. Both babies were protected from the fates they would otherwise have faced. But when the exchange was discovered, both children were destroyed. Both mothers were destroyed. And the family that uncovered the deception destroyed itself in the process of punishing everyone involved. I am giving this testimony because I want this story documented. I want people to understand the impossible situations enslaved women faced and the desperate measures they sometimes took to try to protect their children. I want people to understand that Rachel's light-skinned baby and Mrs. Ashworth's dark-skinned baby both faced terrible fates because of the racial system of slavery. One would be enslaved despite appearing white. The other would be rejected despite being born to a white mother. The exchange was an attempt by 2 mothers to save their children from that system. I also want people to understand that the discovery of the exchange resulted in more cruelty, not less. Both babies, who were innocent, were punished for their mother's deception. Mary died. Thomas was sold into slavery and disappeared. The system that made the exchange seem necessary was the same system that destroyed both children when the exchange was revealed. This is one of the saddest stories I know. 2 mothers trying to save their babies. 2 babies who might have been protected by the exchange. All destroyed when the truth came out. Angela reads Sarah's testimony multiple times, overwhelmed by the tragedy of the story. 2 women, one desperate to save her dark-skinned baby from rejection and violence, one desperate to save her light-skinned baby from slavery, had made an agreement to exchange their children. The exchange had worked for 2 years. Then discovery had led to both children being destroyed, both mothers being destroyed, and the white family's entire fortune and status being destroyed. Angela contacts Dr. Michael Chang, a historian at the University of South Carolina who specializes in the complexities of race, family, and slavery, particularly unusual cases that reveal the contradictions and cruelties of the system. Michael has spent decades researching stories that challenge simple narratives about slavery and that show the impossible situations people faced. Michael calls her back within an hour, his voice heavy with emotion. The exchange of 1821. I've heard fragments of this story, but never with this level of detail. If you have Sarah's complete testimony and documentation of what happened, This would be one of the most important accounts we have of how enslaved women and white women sometimes formed desperate alliances to try to protect their children, and how those alliances could end in tragedy. Send me everything. Angela shares all the materials with Michael. They arrange to meet at the South Carolina Historical Society to examine any additional records about the Ashworth family, Rachel, and the aftermath of the discovery. Over the following weeks, Angela and Michael piece together the complete story through Sarah's testimony, Ashworth family records, court documents from James Ashworth's divorce proceedings, property records showing the decline of the Ashworth fortune, and oral histories from both black and white communities that remembered the exchange as a cautionary tale. From court records of James Ashworth's divorce from Carolyn Ashworth in 1824, they find documentation confirming the basic facts of Sarah's account. Caroline confessed in court to having given birth to a child that was not her husband's and to exchanging that child with an enslaved woman's child. The divorce was granted on grounds of adultery and fraud. From property records, they find documentation of Thomas, Rachel's biological son, being sold in 1823 to a slave trader for transport to Mississippi. They also find death records indicating that a child named Mary, listed as a slave child on the Ashworth plantation, died in 1823 at age 2. From Ashworth family papers, they find correspondence from the 1820s, 1840s, showing the family's social and economic decline. Business partners severed relationships, debts accumulated, and eventually the plantation was sold. They find an obituary for Caroline Ashworth from 1847, describing her as formerly of means, latterly destitute, died alone and unattended by family, a cautionary tale of the consequences of moral failure. They find no further records of Rachel after her sale in 1823, confirming Sarah's testimony that Rachel died approximately 1825. Most remarkably, they find oral histories from black communities in South Carolina that remembered Rachel and the exchange. From testimony collected in the 1930s from elderly formerly enslaved people. My grandmother told me about Rachel and the exchange. She said Rachel was a seamstress, very skilled, very intelligent. When her baby was born looking almost white, Rachel knew the baby would face particular cruelty. Maybe sold away, maybe kept, but treated even worse, because his appearance would remind everyone of white men's violence against enslaved women. When the white lady's baby was born dark-skinned, Rachel saw an opportunity. She proposed the exchange. For 2 years, it worked. Rachel raised the white lady's dark-skinned baby and loved her. The white lady raised Rachel's light-skinned baby as her own heir. But when it was discovered, both babies were destroyed. Rachel's biological son was sold away and disappeared. The white lady's biological daughter was taken from Rachel and died shortly after. Rachel was beaten and sold away. She died from grief. My grandmother said Rachel's story shows that enslaved mothers would do anything to try to save their children, even make impossible agreements that might not work. She said Rachel's story also shows that the racial system was so rigid that even switching babies couldn't truly protect them. When the truth came out, both children were punished for being on the wrong side of the racial line. Angela and Michael worked to create an exhibition that honors both women's desperate attempt to save their children while honestly documenting the tragic outcome. They work with descendants of enslaved people from the region to ensure the story is told respectfully. 21 months after Angela first opened that package, the Schomburg Center opens the exhibition, The exchange of 1821, when two mothers' desperate agreement ended in tragedy. The exhibition occupies a gallery designed to examine the impossible situations created by slavery's racial system and the desperate measures people sometimes took to try to protect their children. The centerpiece is the 1871 commemorative photograph showing the visual inversion of a white woman holding a black baby and a black woman holding a white baby, staged 50 years after the actual exchange to document what had occurred. A detailed explanation accompanies the image. This photograph from 1871 commemorates an exchange that occurred in 1821. Carolyn Ashworth, a wealthy white woman called the Countess, gave birth to a dark-skinned baby. Rachel, an enslaved woman, gave birth to a light-skinned baby. To save both children, one from rejection and violence, one from slavery, the women secretly exchanged their babies. For 2 years, Caroline raised Rachel's son as her heir, while Rachel raised Caroline's daughter as her own child. The exchange was discovered in 1823. Caroline's biological daughter was taken from Rachel and died shortly after. Rachel's biological son was declared enslaved and sold away. Both mothers were destroyed. Rachel died in 1825. Caroline died impoverished and disgraced in 1847. The Ashworth family fortune collapsed. The exhibition tells the complete tragic story through Sarah's testimony, court records, property records documenting the children's fates, and oral histories remembering Rachel. The exhibition does not shy away from the complexity, examining why both women believed the exchange was necessary, why it worked for 2 years, and why its discovery led to such devastating consequences. One section examines Caroline Ashworth's situation, giving birth to a dark-skinned baby in a society where this revealed infidelity and faced immediate rejection, facing divorce and social destruction, making a desperate agreement with an enslaved woman to save both her baby and her position. Another section focuses on Rachel's situation, being subjected to sexual violence by her enslavers, giving birth to a light-skinned baby who would face particular cruelty within slavery, proposing the exchange as an attempt to save her son from slavery, despite his appearance. The exhibition documents the 2 years when the exchange worked. Thomas raised as the Ashworth heir, Mary raised by Rachel as her beloved daughter, both children protected from the fates they would otherwise have faced. The exhibition examines the discovery and its aftermath. The taking of Mary from Rachel, Mary's death at age 2, Thomas being declared enslaved and sold away at age 2, Rachel's punishment and sale and death in 1825, and Caroline's divorce and descent into poverty and death in 1847, the Ashworth family's complete collapse. A section on interpretation acknowledges that this story can be understood in multiple ways, as a tale of maternal love and desperate alliance, as a demonstration of how slavery's racial system made it impossible to truly protect children across racial lines, as evidence of how enslaved women sometimes collaborated with white women in attempts to resist or subvert the system, and as a tragedy that destroyed everyone involved, despite the mother's intentions to save their children. The exhibition includes broader context about mixed-race children under slavery, how enslaved women's light-skinned children faced particular vulnerabilities, how white women who gave birth to visibly mixed-race children faced social destruction, how the racial system created impossible situations for mothers on both sides of the color line. A video plays continuously featuring historians discussing the exchange, examining what it reveals about maternal desperation under slavery, and reflecting on why even an agreement that worked for 2 years could not ultimately protect children from a system designed to enforce racial hierarchy through violence. On opening day, Angela stands in the gallery watching visitors engage with the exhibition. She sees people study the commemorative photograph, understanding that this staged image from 1871 represents an actual exchange from 1821, a desperate agreement between two mothers that briefly worked, but ultimately failed catastrophically. Michael stands beside her, looking at the exhibition. "This story refuses simple interpretation," he says quietly. "Rachel and Carolyn made an agreement to save their children. For 2 years, it worked. Thomas was free and heir to a fortune. Mary was enslaved, but loved and protected. Then discovery led to both children being destroyed, both mothers being destroyed, and the white family destroying itself in the process of punishing everyone. The story shows maternal love and desperate collaboration, but also the impossibility of truly subverting slavery's racial system, even through such a radical exchange." A young black woman approaches them after spending a long time reading Sarah's testimony, tears streaming down her face. "Rachel tried to save her son from slavery by exchanging him for a white woman's baby," she says, her voice breaking. "For 2 years, her son was free. Then, when the exchange was discovered, he was declared enslaved and sold away. He was 2 years old. Rachel never saw him again. She died 2 years later, probably from grief. That's heartbreaking. A mother who made an impossible agreement to save her child. And when it was discovered, her child was punished, and she died from losing him." An elderly white woman stops to read about Carolyn Ashworth for a long time. "Carolyn gave birth to a dark-skinned baby and knew her life was over. Her husband would reject her. Society would destroy her," she says. "She agreed to Rachel's proposal to exchange babies because it was her only hope. For 2 years, she raised Rachel's son as her own. Then, when the exchange was discovered, Rachel's son was taken from her and enslaved. Her own daughter was taken from Rachel and died. And Carolyn lost everything. She spent the rest of her life impoverished and disgraced, dying alone in 1847. No one was saved. Everyone was destroyed." A historian approaches Angela and Michael. "This story challenges our understanding of relationships between enslaved women and enslavers," he says. "Rachel and Caroline formed an alliance based on mutual desperation, both mothers trying to save their babies from terrible fates. They collaborated for 2 years successfully, but when discovered, the system destroyed everyone involved." The story shows that individual acts of resistance or subversion, even when they involve collaboration across racial lines, ultimately could not overcome slavery's fundamental violence and rigidity. Throughout the day, visitors engage deeply with the exhibition, understanding that the exchange of 1821 represents both maternal desperation and the tragic impossibility of protecting children from slavery's racial system through individual agreements, no matter how radical. As the museum prepares to close that evening, Angela walks through the gallery one more time. She stops in front of the commemorative photograph, looking at the deliberately inverted image. White woman holding black baby. Black woman holding white baby. She thinks about 1821, Rachel giving birth to a light-skinned baby who would face slavery and particular cruelty, Caroline giving birth to a dark-skinned baby who would face rejection and violence, the two women making a desperate agreement to exchange their babies, 2 years when both children were protected, then discovery leading to Mary's death at age 2, Thomas's sale into slavery at age 2, Rachel's death in 1825 at approximately 27 years old, Carolyn's descent into poverty and death in 1847, the Ashworth family's complete collapse. She thinks about what the exchange reveals, that enslaved mothers would do anything to try to save their children, that white mothers facing similar desperation could form alliances with enslaved women based on shared maternal love, that even radical acts of subversion like exchanging babies could not ultimately overcome slavery's systematic enforcement of racial hierarchy, and that discovery of such subversion led to violence against everyone involved, especially the innocent children the mothers had tried to protect. The photograph waited 154 years to tell this story fully. The staged image from 1871, commemorating an exchange from 1821, has become testimony to maternal desperation, to a brief moment when two mothers' agreement protected both children, and to the devastating tragedy that followed, when the agreement was discovered and the system destroyed everyone involved in the attempt to subvert racial hierarchy. Now the photograph and exhibition have fulfilled a purpose both mothers would have wanted. Their attempt to save their children has been documented and honored. The tragedy of the outcome has been fully acknowledged, and future generations can understand that slavery created impossible situations where even the most desperate and creative acts of maternal love ultimately could not protect children from a system designed to enforce racial hierarchy through violence, separation, and death. Rachel and Caroline tried to save their babies through an impossible exchange, and for 2 years they succeeded. But discovery transformed their act of maternal alliance into a tragedy that destroyed both children, both mothers, and the family that revealed the secret. A story that demonstrates both the power of maternal love to transcend racial boundaries and the ultimate impossibility of protecting children from a system built on the premise that racial lines could never be truly crossed without catastrophic consequences.